Hey there, everybody. So this week we're going to be looking at Chapter 3 of World Societies for our World History class, Foundations of Indian Society, up to about 300 CE. All right. The land and its first settlers, circa 3000 to 1500 BCE. So India had an early civilization, the same as Egypt, the same as Mesopotamia. First built up around the Indus River Valley. Again, another similarity, another river valley. Geography in India is quite interesting. It is far more diverse than we have seen in the other civilizations we've looked at. Land formations vary widely across the Indian subcontinent. Most areas are warm, wet, monsoon, rains that come in from the Indian Ocean, while you have other areas that are desert, scrub, arid, mountainous. You pretty much have just about every geography and climate type within India as the whole, quite varied. You have large river systems, large mountain ranges, large deserts, all of this. The Ganges and the Indus rivers, these are in the northwestern part of what we think of as India. Generally close to Mesopotamia, these river valleys of the Ganges and the Indus. We know that they were being used as fertile farming, agricultural production by 7000 BCE. So by about 9,000 years ago, we are having farming communities, towns, villages, and certainly starting to develop advanced agricultural techniques, domestication of plants, domestication of animals. This is approximately 2,000 years after Mesopotamia. It is reasonable to assume, and we don't know, that many of the farming agricultural techniques learned in India, that they might have learned them from Mesopotamia. Because in 2,000 years, it would have been easy for these techniques to have migrated eastward a couple thousand miles on trade routes and things like this. Just simply migration of peoples over a 2,000-year period. It's certainly conceivable. Now, Indian people are Indian people. Don't get it confused. They're a totally different group of people. But the techniques that they learned, they might have borrowed or learned from other peoples, possibly. We don't know, but it's certainly logical. So we have these Neolithic settlements by about 7000 BCE based on agriculture. Two of the more common crops they grew were wheat and barley. Of course, domesticated animals like cattle and sheep. Early Indian settlements were probably part of this is the first civilization, and again, make sure you don't ever get confused by that. The early farming communities are when they're learning how to domesticate crops, animals, and they start to settle down. That's not civilization. That is missing many elements of civilization that we discussed in previous chapters. But the first we think of as really civilization, advanced civilization, is probably the Harappans, developing around 2800 BCE. Another thing that's interesting. So we have Indian peoples that developed agricultural techniques thousands of years later than Mesopotamian Egypt, and yet their civilization develops approximately the same time period. So it seems like once they learned techniques, they also probably learned things from other civilizations that might have actually predated them. Or we could also look at it as if once they learned the agricultural techniques, that what we think of as civilization is simply a natural evolution. That it simply happens eventually, to where they start to accumulate large amounts of food, a power base appears, they have to protect it by building walls, you need soldiers to protect your resources. It's just almost like a natural thing that occurs once we start having large-scale food production. We see this mirrored all across the world. Mesoamerica, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China. Once large-scale food production and farming develops, these other things just seem to happen as natural byproducts of this. Well, the first civilization we call the Harappans developed and probably survived from about 2800 BC to about 1500 BCE over about a 5,000 square mile area, northwest India, to what would today be modern-day Pakistan, and around the Indus River Valley. We believe there were hundreds of Harappan cities. They were centers for trade, crafts, textile, manufacturing. They had a writing system, and they were likely wealthy and culturally unified. Actually, very similar to what we see in Egypt. Culturally, economically, well off, prosperous, we think. We have an interesting example. This is actually a picture here of the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. This is a city. This is a Harappan city. We think it really demonstrates the extent of urban planning, urban development. We know the city included a large grain storage facility, very common in early civilizations, to store all the food and then to redistribute it to the masses of non-farm peoples. They built large ports. There's actually an example off of Mohenjo-Daro, some distance from it, going off into the water, of a large pier, like a large stone pier that was built, going out hundreds of yards. That is now totally underwater, but it indicates that they had a shipping industry. They built boats, obviously. They were big into trade, all kinds of stuff. They had geometrically planned out buildings. I mean, you can see here. Look at it. It's all like perfect squares, perfect rectangles. The entire city was laid out mathematically, so they had a better understanding of engineering, mathematics. They had an indoor drainage system, possibly the most advanced sewer system of this time period, of any civilization we're going to look at, of the earliest civilizations. Quite advanced. They were clearly as advanced, if not possibly more advanced, than any ancient civilization we're going to discuss here in this early part of the book. But we will not probably talk any more about them. Why? We don't know anything about them. We know they had a language. We found their language. We can't decipher it. We can't decipher the language. So other than archaeological evidence, such as what you see in the photo here, we know pretty much nothing about them. Not the case in any other ancient civilization we're looking at. All the others had a written language that we have managed to decipher, at least partially, partially, if not completely. We have not been able to decipher the Harappan civilization's languages. So other than what we dig up out of the ground, we don't know anything else about them. And, as we're going to discuss, they also basically disappeared for a period of time. We don't know what caused that either, necessarily. But we believe there were hundreds of cities, and by 1500, they're all gone. I mean, the city remains are left, but the people are gone. The cities are emptied out, and something appears to have happened, and their civilization simply withered away. So, the reasons are unclear. Again, no one really knows for sure. There's no evidence of invasion, no evidence of large-scale catastrophe. Scholars have theorized it could be due to economic collapse, environmental collapse, widespread disease. In other words, we really don't know. Something, though, wiped out their civilization. And by 1500, the Harappans are gone. They're gone, destroyed, or they've just simply faded off into the woods and jungles and forests of India. But their civilization pretty much ceases to exist. We don't really know why. But they do disappear. Well, India then enters a dark age, similar to what we see with the Greeks. Only the Greek dark age lasted 200 years, give or take. The Indian dark age lasted almost 1,000 years. For the better part of 1,000 years, India has no written language, no written records. Obviously, they still spoke, and they still had peoples and towns, but for about 1,000 years, civilization in India just simply ceases to exist, as we think of a civilization. That still doesn't mean there's not hundreds of thousands and millions of people living there, but they're still probably primarily gone back to tribal, Stone Age. They've basically gone back a few thousand years technologically. Socially, culturally, and religiously, we do still see some advances. But technologically, they pretty much go back to the Dark Ages, the Stone Dark Ages. Tribal, no advanced land or society, and no written language we have any record of. And by this time period, records would probably survive. We have written records from civilizations all across the world from this time period of 1000 BCE. So if there was something, we would have probably found traces of it. There simply isn't. They lost the ability to read and write for the better part of a millennia after the Harappans fell. This gives you an idea of the Harappan civilization, what we believe. And again, this is close to what we think of as Pakistan today, northwestern India, Indus River Valley right here, Ganges is over here. These are highly populated areas today. I mean, some places along the Ganges today have millions of people that live in different areas. We have large cities and whatnot. Of course, today India is one of the most populous countries in the world, number one or number two in the world. All right. Well, the group that comes in next that we're going to talk about, and you can see here, you can see Mesopotamia is right over here. You can see it on the map, and then of course Egypt and the Greeks, the early Greek civilizations over here. The next group we're going to talk about are the Aryans. The Aryans, whatever you want to call it. Don't have this confused with Aryan of like white supremacy or something. It's nothing to do with that. That is even though I think it might be spelled the same way, they're not connected. Not to be confused with Aryans of the Christian sect in Europe. There was a group of Aryans spelled with an I, Christian offshoot. That has nothing to do with this either. These are all three separate things. So these are the Aryans during the Vedic Age. This period is known as the beginnings of most modern Indian traditions. This is when Hinduism develops. This is when the caste system develops. And we'll talk about all those, and we can pretty much thank the Aryans for all of it. The Aryans who are not Indian are the ones that pretty much brought in and created all of what we think of as Indian, a lot of what we think of as Indian culture and Indian society was really created by them as a way of oppression, as a way of oppressing the Indian peoples. However, it was so widespread that it simply became adopted as standard Indian culture. Now, most theories had the Aryans coming to India from regions up closer to Europe. You can see here on the map, you have India here, and the Aryans came from, generally we think of as more like north of modern-day Turkey, Balkans region, southwestern Europe. Today, what we might think of as some of the areas that were part of Russia, the Soviet Union, that type of area. That's generally because of the language similarities. The Aryans had a language that was actually similar to our modern European languages of English, German, and French. This is what we often refer to as linguistically Indo-European language. We call it Indo because of this region, and then European. So the Aryans were not Indian. They were from outside of India. They were another people, another population of who knows how many, probably tens if not hundreds of thousands, that slowly over several centuries migrated into northern India and basically took over. Came to dominate northern India, but they were not Indian peoples. They were probably most likely European, Asian peoples from northwestern Asia or Eastern Europe. What brought them there, we still don't know. We still don't know what brought them there. Usually what had forced migrations of large populations had to do with warfare and violence. Basically, one group attacks another group, forces that group to move here, and this group attacks that group, and like dominoes. Each group pushing out the other group. We see that happen a lot in Asian history. It's pretty common. So, there's even some that actually believe the Harappans are the Aryans. Somehow the Harappan civilization collapsed and then reformed as these Aryan peoples, but also that this language might have been some form of European language as well, which leads to the idea that the Harappans might have possibly been Indo-European in some way or another. It's a lot of speculation. If we could actually decipher Harappan writings, it might entirely change what we think of as history of India, ancient history of India. But bottom line, since we can't decipher it, we don't exactly know where the Harappans came from. We're not 100% clear where the Aryans came from. What we do know is they're not Indian. That's about the only thing we do know. Culturally, color of skin, language, their entire structure of society, everything they brought with them was entirely alien to India. They were not alien, they were not Indian peoples, even though they did eventually come to dominate Indian society and culture. We call this the Aryan period, 1500 to 500. This is when they moved in, migrated in, and then, or migrated from the Harappans, which collapsed. However, they moved into northern and central India and began to dominate the culture. The Aryans and the Rigvedo, orally transmitted, written down around 500. All right. One of the very few things we have actually written down during this time period is the Rigvedo. Again, it's not Harappan. It's not in the Harappan language. It's in this Aryan Indo-European language, which eventually becomes sort of morphed. It sort of blends into Indian language. This is a compilation of hymns, rituals, great epic stories. It becomes a religious text, although initially it was probably just a narrative story. It was an epic poem. Think like Gilgamesh, Epic of Gilgamesh. Initially it was probably an epic poem that eventually becomes a religious text over time. It gives us a lot of information on the Aryans, tells us a great deal about the Aryan society, the Aryan culture, because it was written down during their dominance in India. So it tells us a lot about them. It might have been not put down, or the copies that we have available to us are from 500s. The earliest copies were from 500 BCE. So before that, if there was written down, it's lost, or it was orally transmitted, maybe kept alive for several hundred years before writing resurfaced in India, and they were able to actually write this stuff down. Who were the Aryans? What were the Aryans? The closest approximation that we're very familiar with here in Western culture would be Vikings. Be clear, they're not Vikings, they're not related to the Vikings, but they were similar in the way they acted to what we think of as Vikings. Hard drinking, aggressive, warriors, might makes right. They believed in trial by battle. They were warriors. Probably one of the reasons they were able to be so aggressive and dominate and take over northern India. That's what they were. They were conquerors. That's the kind of people the Aryans were when they came in. They had advanced military skills. They used chariots. They had bronze weaponry. They came from the Middle East, closer to the Middle East in Europe, which was a constant war area. We sort of talked about that. The Mesopotamians were constantly at war. The Egyptians were constantly at war. You have the Canaanites, and you have the Assyrians, and you have all other kinds of groups that were constantly fighting each other. So they came from a region of Middle East, Mediterranean region, somewhere over there, that was under constant warfare. So it's not surprising that when they came into India, they brought this with them. They brought advanced technologies of weaponry and, of course, warfare and violence. They had a social system with the priests and the basically warlords at the top. Priests and warlords at the top, and everybody who was conquered at the bottom. These priests were known as Brahmins. These were the high priests, if you will, of their cultural, of their religion. And they were, it was a society led by this belief in gods and their gods, and with the priests at the top, the only ones who knew the rules, the laws, and of course they were a warrior society. Eventually, the Aryans move into the Middle East region. They move into the Indus Valley. They move over to the Ganges Valley. They began to clear all the jungle, defeating and destroying all the local Indian populations, and they start building cities. They bring the modern age with them for this time period. They bring everything with them: technology, weapons, language, culture. They bring it all with them, and they start to build an advanced civilization in northern India. Eventually, the Aryans rule large civilizations, but it's not an empire. Not really. What we really see, and the reason I say it's not an empire has aspects of dominating weaker neighbors. That we have. They come in and dominate the Indian population. We don't call it an empire because it's not unified. What we end up with is when the Aryans come in essence, every small group, it's almost like city-states again. Every small group is actually dominated by warlords and priests that are in competition with the next Aryan city-state and the next one. And we don't know how many there were, but there could have been dozens. So, in that way, militarily and sociopolitically, they probably resemble the Greeks. In the fact that it was a large number of kings and warlords, constant competition. But don't be confused, they're not Greeks. They're not Greek. But yet, socio-politically, it looks a lot like them. It's interesting. Real interesting stuff. We don't know much about the Aryans. Other than the Rigveda and a few other writings, we don't know much about them. Because they, for most of their history, also didn't write anything down. So we're very limited to what we know about them as well. By the time we actually start getting writing again, regular writing again in India, 500 BCE-ish, the Aryan population is pretty much assimilated into the Indian population. And other than skin color, it would have been difficult to tell the difference between an Aryan and an Indian. They spoke the same language, they had the same culture, they wrote the same religion. So other than skin color, it would have been difficult to tell the difference. And we know the Aryans were much lighter skin color, almost white. Another reason that we believe they came from we believe they came from Europe or northern Asia somewhere, because their skin color was much lighter. Skin color is entirely a result of geography and climate. It says there's no genetics, there's no difference in intelligence or capability or anything. It's just simply climate and geography which influences skin color over many thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. So that's where that comes from. So another reason we believe they came from that part of the world, due to their much lighter skin color. Here we see some migrations here. This is, what is this, a Black Sea, I think? I think that's the Black Sea. So this would actually be the edge of, like, Russia today. This was Eastern Europe. Well, I guess technically at this point it's actually Western Asia. This is actually Western Asia, I guess, into this region right here, because this would be Turkey here, right? And so this would be Europe here. And so this is technically Western Asia. But yeah, it is this region of what today would be modern-day Eastern Europe, Western Russia, the Stan countries. With all I don't know the names of them, but like several countries in here with the last name being, Stan and the names. That's this region here, which is also sometimes part of the Middle East. So this is a region we think, again, as it says here on the map, it's possible that they came in and they basically dominated some places in the Middle East and much of northern India. But note on this, the Harappan civilization was over here. Not really. We really don't see the Aryan peoples there, which still begs some questions. There's lots of questions about the relationship between the Aryans and the Harappans, because around the same time the Aryans come to dominate, the Harappans decline. But there is no obvious evidence that the two peoples interacted. Is it purely coincidence that we have this large civilization invade northern India at the same time that the civilization that exists in western India pretty much collapses? We're not really sure. Not really sure. Nonetheless, that gives you an idea of what we're looking at there. All right, what was life like in early India? Well, the caste system really began through the establishment of elite groups of priests and warriors. And these priests and warriors, if you haven't figured it out yet, these were the Aryans. The priests and warriors at the top were the Aryans, and just about everyone else who wasn't part of the Brahmin class or and I may say some of these wrong, so please don't, just have to live with it. I apologize if I say I'm wrong. I don't mean to. The Kshatriyas and the Brahmins are the typically Aryans. And then you have people down here. I know it shows the Sudras, the farm workers, servants, and laborers. This is where we see the Indian population primarily. But over time, we do see a blurring of the lines between the Vaisyas and the Sudras. We see this blurring here between the Aryans and Indian population to some degree. But these upper two castes, Brahmins and Kshatriyas, are almost exclusively Aryan for a very long time. Very long period of time. We see these elite groups of warriors and priests, and then eventually we see this third group in the middle, the Vaisyas, added, which is led by the Aryans, but we do see some lower class, lower caste, which would be Indian populations included in there as well. Eventually, these castes all become hereditary, which means, and that's the name there for it, the Varna, the caste system. Eventually, these groups become hereditary. In other words, if you're born into the Vaisya class, or if your parent is and you're born, you're in that caste. So it makes it very challenging to change castes. You're born into a caste. If you're born into an upper caste, hey, good for you. If you're born into a lower caste, you're going to live a life of poverty and oppression. You were not supposed to interact with people in different castes. You weren't supposed to eat together. You certainly weren't supposed to marry or have relationships. Other than professional dealings in a business environment, there really was supposed to really be no interaction between the castes, except it was required for professional business dealings or times of necessity. Socially, culturally, you really weren't supposed to associate with people from the other caste. Again, this is a very clear system of oppression. A system of the upper caste, Aryans, trying to keep the vastly superior in numbers. Indian populations outnumbered Aryans probably 100 to 1 or more. Vastly larger population of the Sudras, the lower caste, but it was a system to keep them in line, to control them, a system of control and oppression, very clearly. And then, of course, there was actually the fifth caste. If you've ever heard the term an outcast, if you're an outcast, that's where this comes from. If you were the fifth caste, you were an outcast, the ones who don't fit into any other caste. You're the impure, the undesirables. Generally, these are people that had anything to do with bodily fluids, trash, waste. If you worked with animals, these are people that were, because you were unclean. Once you had touched bodily fluids and raw fluids of animals or blood or waste product, human waste or something like that, you were unclean. So there was a large group of outcasts at the very bottom, the undesirables, the untouchables, literally untouchable. You had to ask forgiveness, and you had to go to a priest if you'd ever actually physically touched someone who was part of the undesirable. The top two castes were entirely Aryan. The Vaisyas were generally Aryan to begin with, although there is a little bit of blending there between the castes. And pretty much the conquered Indian peoples were all the Sudras. This was attributed to the gods, by the way. This entire structure was actually a form of the gods. That's how they, again, another way that religion is used as oppression of the masses. They use this Hindu religion to say that this was the form of the god. The priests were the head. The warriors were the arms. The body was the Vaisya. And then the ones that did all the work was the feet. The laborers, the ones that got dirty and did the work, was the Sudras. Indians, the Indian population. So the ones that thought and had intelligence, or were strength and had powerful, or the body that had the soul and the real meat of the gods, that was all supposed to be basically Aryans. And then the Sudras made up the worker class at the bottom. And this was all manifested through religious belief, and this was supposed to be the body of the gods, and this was a way, as it often is in early societies, the Indian, it's no different here, that, hey, we're the bosses, you're the undesirables, you're the oppressed, and it's supposed to be that way because the gods said it that way. Well, how do you know that? Well, because we talk to the gods. We're the priests, we talk to the gods, so therefore we know. So the gods have said that we should live in luxury and be comfortable and be educated and have servants and slaves, and you all should be the servants and slaves. How convenient. Yeah, well, we see that in pretty much all societies. Nothing unusual or unique here. Religion used to justify subjugation and subservience of the masses. Slavery existed as well, of course. Slavery existed everywhere. All societies had slaves. And Sudras weren't slaves. There were slaves in the society, but if you were a Sudras, you weren't necessarily a slave. But they did have slaves as well. They did war a lot. These Indian-led, or these Aryan-led Indian groups, they did fight a lot. And so, as in any case in war, there's prisoners of war taken and stuff like that. So slavery existed. Gender roles varied according to your Varna status. So depending on what caste you were in, you had different gender roles, male or female. It was entirely patriarchal, entirely male-led. The priests were all male. The warrior elites were all male. The heads of all families were male. The heads of crafting groups, crafting families and kin groups were all male. Patriarchal society. Now, women did have some authority when it came to the family and reproduction and the home. We know this through the Ramayana. Ramayana is an epic poem. It's an epic poem from around the 3rd century. So the previous one, the Rigvedo, we know we have copies from about the 500 BC is 6th century, by the way. It's always one off. So the 500s is the 6th century. So from the 3rd century, which would be the 200s, we have the Ramayana. We see in there that women are given some power and authority, showing how women actually, it's not really, to be clear, it isn't, how to put it, it doesn't put women in a positive light. It actually treats women as subversive, coercive, dangerous, backstabbing, dominating, untrustworthy, how women tried to steal power from men, how women would try to dominate their husbands. It's been interpreted in different ways. Some interpret the Ramayana as an indication that women did have some power and authority in Indian society, that they did, because it shows them in roles of having authority and basically pushing their male counterparts, their husband, out of the way, and then taking authority. But it also is interpreted in the other way, that women are untrustworthy, that they're not fulfilling their duties. As with many things, it's open to interpretation. What you can get out of it, though, is this. Women were not just pawns. The Ramayana does give the indication that women did actually take an aggressive role in some aspects of society and didn't always get pushed around. But it's often not portrayed in a positive light. In other words, the woman being aggressive or being a leader is seen as not a good thing, that they shouldn't be. However, it shows that some do. So you decide how you want to interpret that. Let's see what else is going here. Okay. We will then move on to the next one, which is Brahmanism. Brahmanism. Don't get this confused. This is Brahman with an I, or pardon me. This is Brahman with an A, versus Brahman here is an I. The Brahmin with an I is the priest class. Brahmanism is a religion, the early religion. Now, it's similar to the other Brahmin, because again, a religion, but the Brahmin with an I is the priest. Brahmanism is the religious, the religion, this early religion, this precursor to what becomes eventually Hinduism. The Aryans were polytheistic. They had an entire pantheon of gods. Now, you may be familiar with some of these gods, you may have heard of them, because these become the Indian gods. As I said, the Aryan culture that was brought in was alien to India, and yet the Aryan culture is what becomes Indian culture. Basically, the entire Indian culture, because it was dominated by Aryans for so many centuries, this becomes Indian culture and Indian religious belief, even though it is not native to India. Now, we do think, as in many times, whenever a foreign religion comes in, there's always local religious beliefs. There's always local spiritualistic beliefs. We think they often syncretize. For simply put, they merge. So we do think you can probably find certain gods in the Indian pantheon that might have been native to India. But some ones I'm going to mention here are ones that probably were introduced by the Aryans. But certainly there was some merging, but primarily culture and religion, it's really what the Aryans introduced, or what was formed in India during Aryan dominance. They were very polytheistic. They had lots of gods. Indra, for instance, was a god. God of war. Rudra, god of disaster. Now, people didn't pray to the gods. What they did is they performed rituals and sacrifices, and they did... It was more like a business transaction. They didn't pray to the gods asking for blessings or hope or forgiveness or curses. They did rituals, they did sacrifices, they looked for omens, things where they believed that they were messages from the gods in some way. But they didn't believe that they could directly communicate with the gods. Now, the Brahmin priests did, but regular Indian people, which of course was the other 99.9%, did not. The only ones that would have been directly communing with the gods would have been the Brahmin priests. Everyone else did like rituals or expected the Brahmin priests to be sort of caregivers for the rest of society. Now, the Brahmin priests loved this because this gave them absolute power and control. Because if they were the only ones who could talk to the gods, they're the only ones who could commune with the gods, therefore they're the only ones that knew what the gods wanted. Therefore, this again allowed for control of society. And again, the Brahmins were the priests. They were the leaders. They maintained the Varna system. The Varna system was really maintained by the priests and the entire Brahmin class. The warrior class was involved in that as well, enforcing. But it's like the rules were made by the Brahmins, and then the warrior class are the ones that did the enforcing of the rules. They were the ones that spoke to the gods. They were the intermediaries. Eventually, they became the only members of Aryan society that could perform the most significant rituals. The rituals to actually talk to the gods, commune with the gods. They did animal sacrifices, as I said. And they also claimed that if the people were observant and the people treated the Brahmins and treated the Aryans in general with proper respect, that the Brahmin priests could actually force the gods to obey them. If you perform the proper ritual, it would in essence form a contract, a negotiation, to where I do my part, the priests, or pardon me, the gods must therefore respect and do what is asked of them, which would be, bring the rains, cure the plague, defeat our enemies, whatever, stuff like that. The Upanishads, this was a priest handbook, is what it's sort of a priest handbook. That's sort of a most common way to understand it. It was written down somewhere between 750 and 500 BCE. Probably also was passed down orally. Almost everything we have from the Aryans, it just came out of nowhere. Suddenly there's a copy, the earliest copy we find. Of course, it doesn't exist that way. There had to have been previous copies or previous iterations of it. So it was probably an oral tradition passed down from the priests, generation after generation. It records mystical meanings of religious rites, as well as questions about man's relationship with the universe. This is what we refer to as cosmology. Man's relationship to the universe. Not just the gods, although probably the gods are the most significant part of it, but literally everything out there. Everything in existence other than humans right here is cosmology. Theories of creation, theories of the end of time, the beginning of time, theories of why the whole universe exists. All this is cosmology. So we get our term cosmos, the cosmos, which is everything. Many early religious beliefs actually tie into cosmology. This trying to understand the universe, trying to understand where the hell we came from. Where did humans come from? And a lot of early religious beliefs try to explain this a variety of different ways. Indian cosmology often looked at this recycling of human souls. Today we would more commonly call it reincarnation. They believed human souls would be, when you died, your soul would then come back into the world in another form. But that human souls were immortal initially. Now, this evolves over time. But initially, it seems like a human soul was immortal, and it's always damned, if you want to use the term damned. I don't know if they looked at it that way. But it's always destined, there's a better word, always destined to keep coming back. This was this initial belief. Your next life depended on your good and bad deeds in this life. We call that karma. Karma, your good and bad deeds in this life. Are you going to come back and the way you would come back would either be upper or lower on the caste system. So if you did good deeds, karma, you could come back as a higher caste person. If you did not have good karma, you come back as a lower caste person. Literally, you could even come back as an animal. You could actually go all the way down to where you wouldn't be reborn as human. You could be reborn as an animal form. So your goal was always to work your way up the caste system towards the top. That was your goal to do this. Let's see. This is samsara. Samsara is reincarnation. That's what that is. So karma, I just explained. Samsara is the reincarnation. This is all part of the cosmology. And of course, you were always trying to work your way up on this wheel of life. And I guess it's portrayed as a wheel because you could go up, you could come down, you could, and it was this wheel of life, always trying to work your way up towards the top to be higher up on the wheel, trying to better your status. And there was no way out. You would always be reincarnated. And this time period, it was permanent. The soul was immortal, permanent, and you were constantly going to be reincarnated. So there was no way out, really. This reinforced Indian society. It reinforced the oppression of Indian society. If you were a common worker in the field, that's okay. Because your karma, your place in life was to be a worker in the field. You should be the best worker you can be. So be the best farmer you can be the best worker you can be, and then you, in this life, and then after you die, hopefully you'll be reincarnated as a higher caste. So accept your place as a subservient person, as a slave, as a worker, as an oppressed, impoverished farmer. Just accept it. That's the way it's going to be for you and your family forever, and be happy with it. Again, another system of control. However, if you wanted to exit the wheel of life, the only way to get this exit, which is this moksha is exiting the wheel of life, is you have to be a Brahmin class. You have to be part of the Brahmin class, and you have to be a man. Only men could do it. So you had to somehow work your way up to the top, become a Brahmin. Only women could do this, only men could do this. Once you were a Brahmin, you had to spend your entire life in careful study, meditation, contemplation. Then you might actually come to understand, and this is where we get the name of the religion, Brahman. Then you might actually get to understand Brahman. Brahman is basically the meaning of all life, the reality of the universe. Probably the best way we would characterize it today is meaning of life. You'd actually understand, after careful study and contemplation, once you were a Brahmin, once you worked your way up the caste, dying repeatedly until you finally became a Brahmin, you would then study, contemplate, and try to have exit from the wheel of life, again, only if you were a male. And you would understand the reality of the universe. What was the reality of the universe? Under Brahmanism, the reality of the universe is we're all part of the universe. We're all basically part of the same whole. In other words, the universe is one, and we're all just a fraction of that. A minute, infinitesimal fraction of the universe is each one of us. Each one of us has our place in that equation. That equation, which is the entire universe. 100 billion, trillion, quadrillion, and just goes on and on and on. Zeros down. 100,000 zeros down the line. There you are. Like one speck of sand on an entire beach in the universe. That's us. And your goal is really just to do your job as that speck of sand until eventually you can get off this wheel of life and obtain this moksha. And again, and you can understand Brahman, again, only if you're male and ever make it to the Brahmin priest class. Interesting. Now this is Brahmanism, which becomes, with some changes, Hinduism, and also Buddhism develops out of this as well. All right, the two great Indian religions are Buddhism and Hinduism. Today, almost all Indian people are Hindu, but Buddhism is born in there, and we're going to talk about how Buddhism is born. It's really interesting, just to give you how it goes. Brahmanism, let me say it differently, I guess. Buddhism is a response to Brahmanism. Hinduism is a response to Buddhism. So I'll explain it. This is probably the most long-lasting and significant results of early Indian civilizations. These two religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, where today about 20% of the entire world population is Hindu or Buddhist. So 1 out of 5 people in the world today are Hindu or Buddhist. So this is maybe the most significant contribution to this time period in Indian history, is this creation of two world religions. Siddhartha Gautama and Buddhism. He was a member of the warrior class around 500 BCE, the Kshatriya, Aryan warrior class. He lived a life of comfort, a life of peace. He lived behind these fortified walls. He was a young man. Every day he would go out, he would walk, he would see people living in poverty, wanting and suffering and pain, and he came to believe that he could not live with himself, having a life of comfort, while everybody he would see outside the walls of his home or his compound or whatever, I guess he was wealthy or his family was wealthy, he could not live with what he saw every single day, which was oppression and pain and misery and want. So he leaves his home one day, doesn't come back. He goes out and starts talking to the people. He becomes what we call a wandering ascetic. Basically, he gives up all of his worldly goods and starts wandering the streets as a beggar. Trying to find, I guess, the meaning of life. He starts talking to people, sits under a tree. Eventually, he's given the name the Enlightened One as he sits and he talks and communicates with people over time. And this is him. This is the idea. He began to attract followers among the merchants, the artisans, the farmers, primarily the lowest castes. You're going to find an interesting connection. All of what we think of as like world religions today all started in the same place. And by this, I may say it differently. All started with the same people. A wandering prophet, whether it is Jesus, Buddha, whether it is Muhammad, who befriends the masses, the poor, the destitute, the slaves, the impoverished, and then creates a huge following that rises up and establishes a world religion. Jesus did this, Muhammad did this, Buddha did this. This is a common thread we see in a lot of world religions. He starts to attract a lot of followers among common people, a lot of Sudras, including others. I mean, it's not just Sudras. We see other castes as well, but a lot of those people. He dismisses divine authority. He dismisses animal sacrifice. Animal sacrifice is a huge part of Brahmanism. He says animals shouldn't be sacrificed. And so becomes very popular with people because he offers them an alternative, saying there's another way. Other than this oppressive elitist system of Brahmanism, there is another way. And this other way is Buddhism. After he achieves enlightenment, he believes he's able to talk to the gods. He's able to get messages from spirits. He really becomes this public speaker, and he becomes this prophet of the gods, and gets many, many followers, thousands of followers eventually. He comes up with some interesting ideas we refer to as the Four Noble Truths, which lead you down the Eightfold Path. Now, you can read about this in the book. I'm not going to go into detail on these, or hell, you could Google it, whatever. It's easy to find this information. And he believes these Four Noble Truths lead you down the Eightfold Path, and of course, the Eightfold Path leaves you to release. Basically, release from the Wheel of Life. He believed his first preachings was this information about human nature and desire. The simplest part of this is, just to put it really simple, and I am certainly simplifying it here for the purposes of the class. This is a survey class. Basically, life is suffering, and all of our desires cause suffering, and the Eightfold Path, if you follow it and follow this proper code of conduct, the right work, the right actions, living the right way, you could eventually triumph over human weakness and achieve release from reincarnation, samsara, I believe is, if that's the right word, but you achieve release from reincarnation eventually. If you follow the truth, if you accept the truth, follow the path, you can get this. Now, the final step in the Eightfold Path was rightful contemplation. So this was the final step on the path, which might take you your whole life. It could take you years and years to finally get down and live the right life. And when you have rightful contemplation, you achieve nirvana. Nirvana is this kind of bliss, this freedom from reincarnation that you get, understanding nothing. I say it differently. Understanding nothingness. You understand everything by understanding the nothingness of the universe. Release. Nirvana. Nirvana isn't, don't confuse this with like the idea of Christian heaven or something like that. It's not. Nirvana is literally, it's like ceasing to exist. Or, there's another way to look at it, alternatively, you become one with the universe. Either way, as an individual person, as an individual soul, you're gone. Either you cease to exist, or you blend with the universe and now you're just one grain of sand on a beach. But you as an individual are released. You're free. It's over. It's done. You are now one with everything. Or nothing. There's actually different ways to interpret it. Very interesting. Yeah. So why is this so appealing? Well, one, you don't have to be reincarnated over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And I just go on forever. You don't have to worry about being reincarnated as an animal. You don't have to worry about being reincarnated over and over, trying to get to the top. You can do it in this lifetime. So you don't have to worry about being on this wheel of life for an eternity. You can, in one lifetime, achieve release. Get off the wheel of life. Achieve nirvana. Achieve oneness with the universe. Also appealing, hugely appealing to the other 50% of the population, women can be Buddhists, and women can achieve nirvana. You could not as a Brahmin. If you were under Brahmanism, women could never achieve release from the wheel of life. Buddhism, women can. So it appealed to common people because you don't have to necessarily accept your lot in life anymore. You can actually work to have it. Also, Buddhism also allowed poor or rich, it didn't matter. You didn't have to follow rituals. You didn't have to obey Brahmanist traditions and beliefs, which were still primarily Aryan traditions and beliefs. It didn't require books, it literally required you sitting and contemplating the universe, like Buddha did. Very appealing to lots and lots of people. However, it really, really angered the Brahmin priests and the upper castes. This is an image here of Buddha sitting, and if we were in class, I'd take 5 or 10 minutes and talk about this. We don't have time, so I'm just going to look at it we'll look at some things. We have the Buddha sitting. He's actually sitting on a stool. He's crushing soldiers underneath him. Soldiers are being crushed to death under him. Buddhism is sometimes portrayed as this belief of peace and prosperity and contemplation. It isn't always that way. Sometimes peace and prosperity can only be achieved through violence. There are some interpretations of Buddhism that do look at it that way. And I'm not talking about anything to do with terrorism and stuff like that. I'm just saying that sometimes to achieve the peace and prosperity as lower castes, you have to throw off the chains of bondage and oppression of the upper castes. Sometimes that has to be done. And sometimes that can result in violence. We have this frieze here of Buddha actually crushing warriors to death underneath him. And warriors, of course, are the upper caste, the primarily Aryan caste up at the top. Buddha taught nonviolence. Really, Buddha did teach nonviolence, but simultaneously, many people took Buddha's teachings as meaning the only way to achieve peace and prosperity is to have to defeat your oppressor. So there are different interpretations of Buddhism, different ways to look at it. Buddha is portrayed as the peace and prosperity, but sometimes peace and prosperity isn't allowed and a lot of imagery of Buddha does indicate that. You can see a lot of imagery of Buddha from the time period that does actually show sometimes the rising up of the populations. Here we have the animals actually rising up. We have the animals fighting here, and animals, it's really a mixed message. He appears to be tranquil in peace, while all around him there's actually a lot of violence going on. Interesting. He did believe that karma, though, was very important still, and so you did not want to ever have bad karma unless it was necessary. He also challenged existing social hierarchies. He believed that many people, I'll put it the other way around. There's a lot of traditionalists in Indian culture, especially among the Aryans, that believed Buddhism was subversive. They didn't believe that his teachings of peace and prosperity were appropriate for the masses, that the masses needed to be working and not sitting around. They also believed that the masses needed to be obedient and subservient. Buddha taught that they didn't have to be obedient and subservient. They didn't have to suffer under the lash of a master if they didn't want to. It's interesting stuff. We do find that generally the idea of Buddhism is preaching this idea of peace and prosperity, but Buddhism some also have taken a militant. You'll find in Buddhist temples, and this was very traditional in Indian culture in later years, Buddhist temples are often protected by Buddhist warrior priests. Peace and prosperity, however, if you try attacking us, we're going to fight back, and we will defend ourselves with all due necessity. So Buddhism also taught defense, self-defense. So it's really interesting. It's a very mixed bag. Hinduism sees this as a total threat to their culture. I'll take that differently. Brahmanism sees this as a threat to their culture and society, and so Brahmanism actually morphs. It changes. It adapts to deal with Buddhism, and we get a new religion formed, what we will call Hinduism. So in response to both Jainism and Buddhism, I'm not really talking about Jainism. You can look it up in the book. This was taking away many of the followers of the Brahmanistic religion. We see this new form of Brahmanism develop, what we will eventually call Hinduism. Essentially, it is the same classic religion of ancient India that we've been talking about, with a few changes to make it more appealing to the masses, and basically allowing it to compete with Jainism and Buddhism. All right. Whoa. Let's go back to this. Okay. Hindu beliefs identify the Vedas. The Vedas, which are essentially religious texts, as sacred revelations from the gods that support the caste system in society. So, no real change there. In essence, the Vedas, other Hinduism, continue to stratify society into the caste system, continue to generally create a system of stratification and oppression of the masses of Indian population. Still, if you're born into a caste, that's your caste. That's what you're born into. All right. Now, to achieve this ultimate goal of reaching union with Brahman, which is this ultimate goal of union with Brahman, the union, basically the reality of the universe, the followers, who, by the way, again, this is a period of 600 years, from 400 BCE to 200 CE. That crosses over the 0 mark. So that's a 600-year period. Over this 600-year evolution of what we really think of as modern Hinduism, there's some changes, some significant ones. One, they now allow women. By, I don't know exactly what year that happened, but over this course of evolution, they now allow women who could actually get released from the wheel of life. Women can elevate their status and eventually achieve oneness with the universe. They now come up with this new idea of what we call dharma, which is moral law. This might have been its greatest appeal, really, because moral law, this new type of law, which said, in essence, it's interesting. I won't get into it, but we have some modern correlations to this in modern religions, Christianity and others, to where it's okay, as long as you are obeying the rules of a religion, it's okay to have status, to have wealth, to have money, have prosperity. And I don't just mean having enough food on the table for your family. I mean, you can be rich and wealthy. You can have everything. You can have sexual pleasure. You can have multiple partners, not marriages, but it's okay to basically be promiscuous and have lots of sex and stuff like this. Hinduism starts to develop into this system that allows people to enjoy life more. It's not as structured or rigid as it used to be. And previously, if you were in the upper castes, you could enjoy life. You could have servants and you could live comfortably. But now all castes, even as a Sudras, even though you're still going to be Sudras, you can actually start to accumulate wealth. It is certainly possible under Hinduism to be lower caste and yet have more wealth and prosperity than someone who's above you. So you could be low caste and be wealthy. It can happen. And so this is allowed, which hadn't really been allowed before. You were pretty much stuck in whatever your caste was as socioeconomically. You can now accumulate wealth, you can have pleasure, you can have sex, more leisure pursuits. Especially as you start to accumulate wealth, leisure goes hand in hand, as everyone knows. The more money you make, the more leisure time you have available. The more ways you can have leisure time. You can have more activities, more extracurricular activities. You can do more things the more money you have. You can eat better food. So that's very appealing. This new moral law, which says, in essence, if you're a good person and you're following the proper dharma and you have good karma, then screw it. Enjoy life. Have a good time. Have fun. Whenever you're not working or whatever. And of course, they now opened it up to the other half of the population. Now women can actually escape and actually have more success as well in the culture. So central to the Hindu religion, of course, is polytheism. That had always been that way, this polytheistic religion believing in many gods. It's almost a form of animism, actually, because there's gods of water, gods of earth, gods of spirits, gods of rocks, gods of sky, gods of everything. Thousands of gods, actually. This very huge pantheon of gods, probably the largest pantheon of gods of any religious belief. Literally thousands of different gods and different spirits that is central to this. Much of this was part of Brahmanism, but it expands greatly under Hinduism to become even bigger. Everybody's part of Brahman, though, with an A. Everybody is part of Brahman, the great mystery of the universe. Everyone is part of it. Central to this new belief in Hinduism is the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is part of an epic story, another sort of an epic narrative. Not a poem, but a narrative, which is simply a story. But it becomes a sacred story. It becomes a story that is central to the Hindu beliefs. It's a morality tale, what we would really call it. We're used to Christianity has lots of morality tales. Much of the Bible is basically a morality tale. So it's about what to do, what's right, what's wrong, stuff like this. And really, the Bhagavad Gita should help you make decisions in life to honor your dharma, achieve good karma, and of course, ultimately, achieve release from the wheel of life, which everybody can do now, easier under this new Hindu belief. The focus of the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm not going into detail on it here, but just a couple sentence summary. It's really about this hero Arjuna who fears killing enemies. He doesn't want to kill enemies because he thinks he'll get bad dharma for killing enemies. And because he doesn't want to kill people. He thinks killing people is bad. You shouldn't kill people. Well, he's advised by the god Krishna. The god Krishna talks to him, and he's supposed to carry out his duties because he's of the warrior class. Therefore, if you're a warrior, how do you get good karma? How do you get good dharma? By killing people. That's your job. If you're in the warrior caste, your job is to kill people, for the right reasons. We're talking about murder, but I'm just saying to kill people for the right reasons, that is part of your caste. So he's convinced by the gods to do his duty. He'll get the woman. He'll have life. He'll be successful in life doing all these things. So this is what it ultimately is. It reinforces the caste system. The Bhagavad Gita is a total reinforcement of the caste system. Still, if whatever your place is in society, do the best you can in your place, achieving the most wealth and success and prosperity you can. Even if you're lower caste, you can achieve wealth and prosperity, and you'll be rewarded doing this. So his good dharma comes from killing and protecting people. Just like a good merchant's dharma would come from buying and selling goods fairly. Being a fair merchant, buying and selling goods for fair prices and fair profit. There you go. And it works. Eventually, Buddhism, as we'll get to later, Buddhism is pushed out of India. It takes a long time, but eventually Buddhism is pushed out of India. And today, I don't know the percentage, but almost all Indian people are Hindu. It's interesting because it isn't just the religion of most Indian peoples, it's their culture, it's their society. It's a socio-cultural religious belief. It's as much religion as their society. It's everything. Hinduism guides most Indian peoples in most of their daily activities and jobs. Today, of course, there's far more than just a handful of castes. There are hundreds and hundreds of castes. I believe the term, I don't have my notes, but I think the term is jati. So there's like hundreds of subcastes today in Indian society. So it is definitely less restrictive than it used to be. But generally the same outline of this system of Hinduism still exists in Indian society today. That's also where it's almost only practiced. You find very few Hindus outside of India, except among Indian peoples who've moved out of India. It is a system that pretty much only appeals to Indian populations. Again, outside of India, you really don't find Hinduism, except among Indian peoples outside the country. So yeah, it's a system that is part and parcel India, and India is Hinduism today. They're interchangeable, really. The god Vishnu here, we have the god Vishnu enjoying life. This is part of this new Indian culture, this new Hindu culture, India culture. You should enjoy. You should have servants. He's getting his legs massaged. He's getting fed. He's happy. He's in a good place here. Certainly different. The serpent is also interesting here. There's a big serpent in this, and the serpent in Christian theology is usually considered evil, image of Satan or something like that. The serpent isn't seen that way here. The serpent is actually a protector. It's an assistant to Vishnu. It's a good image. The serpent, which is actually different than the rest of the world. Almost any other culture in the world, a serpent is usually portrayed as evil or bad. Not just Christianity. We see it in Mesoamerican culture, Chinese culture. Serpent is don't get me wrong, don't confuse that with dragon image. The dragon image is a very interesting image in Indian culture. But as far as the actual snake, in Chinese culture I meant, but we see the snake often portrayed, in Chinese culture the snake can be portrayed positive or negative. It actually sometimes portrayed as a good spirit and a bad spirit, both. But in most cultures in the world, snakes are portrayed as evil, dirty, filthy, which was natural for early humans because They were dirty, filthy creatures. You walk into the woods, you step, and the snake bites you, and you die. So snake bites often would kill people. So snakes were not seen as a good thing. Not so here. Here's where we actually see snakes seen as a positive idea, protector. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is open to interpretation, because most of these friezes, as we call them, these basically carvings into stone, most of them don't have any writings attached to them. Most of the Indian friezes don't have. It isn't like you look at sculpture in Egypt, for instance. Everything you see in Egypt, almost everything, has hieroglyphs somewhere nearby. Almost any type of imagery we see in Egyptian society, we have an actual interpretation next to it. Indian isn't like that. Many, many sculptures and carvings and friezes in Indian culture have no actual writings nearby. So we have to interpret them. We're not exactly sure what they were meant to mean. So lots of it is open to interpretation. Certainly different than we see in that Gandharan frieze, the one of Buddha. Vishnu is attended by women. He's having a good time. He's getting massage. He's getting fed. He's enjoying the luxuries of life, which is something you can do now under Hinduism, which Buddhism sort of rejected that. Buddhism generally went for more simple life, more ascetic life, what we call asceticism, which is what Buddha did, which was a rejection of a lot of worldly pleasures. Well, Hinduism takes the exact opposite and says, enjoy worldly pleasures. And again, this is purposeful to get people to choose Hinduism over Buddhism, and it's successful. It works. That kind of stuff. He sits relaxing, as opposed to like the Buddhist image. He's very upright and proper, sitting in this pose. Yeah, different thing. Another one which I had barely mentioned was Jainism. Jainism was a total and utter rejection of everything material, even to the point some Jainists didn't wear clothes. They didn't believe they could have anything material whatsoever, anything made by humans. I don't know if they would have worn, like fig leaves or something, or like they wore leaves covering their bodies. I don't know if that would even matter, because most Jainists also didn't believe in taking life. So, and they believed all life was sacred, even plant life. So some Jainists, well, it was not uncommon for Jainists to starve to death, because they were so committed that they didn't even believe in eating anything that was alive, which of course is everything that we can eat. Food or plant matter has been alive. So, yeah. But again, that was an ultimate rejection of everything material. Well, Hinduism said, enjoy the material stuff. As long as you're a good person and you're following your caste, live it up. Which, as I said a little bit ago, that is, you see elements of that in Christianity as well. Elements of that in Christianity as well. As long as you are a good person obeying the rules, you should enjoy the fruits of your endeavors. So, yeah, it's interesting. Let's see what else we got going on here. We can see lots of horizontal layers here in this imagery, which actually represents the caste system. Priests at the top. You have the god in the middle. You have warriors. You have warriors and workers at the bottom. So even this imagery of Vishnu actually portrays the caste system. It shows the hierarchy of society. Some people are above other people, So we even see that here. All right. So we've mostly been talking about. So all we've been talking about is Aryans and religion up to this point. Now we're going to switch over to politics. Yay! A little more about politics and socio-political parts of Indian society. All right. Western contact and the Mauryan unification of North India from 513 to 185 BCE. I said it fast because it's right there in front of you. So you have it right there on screen. All right. We've covered religion, covered society. We're going to talk about war and conquest. Over the next 700-year period, India was involved in and conducted some of its own conquests from Greece, thousands of miles to the west, to China, thousands of miles to the east. What did I just say? Over the next 700 years, northern India is in constant conflict Wars to the west, all the way towards Greece. Wars to the east, all the way towards China. Wars among themselves. As I said, under the Aryans, basically northern India was a whole slew of kingdoms, city-states. Well, eventually India becomes an actual empire. The first Indian empire, the Mauryan Empire. So, let's talk about it a little bit. All right, so we have some different power bases around India. We have Indian people themselves in India. North of India, we have the Persians. West of India, we have Mediterranean. We have lots of groups over to the west of India. The biggest, probably outside threat in this time period is the Persians. Really. Persian Emperor Darius. He came in sometime around 513, and he actually conquered northern India, all through the Indus Valley. He conquered that entire region, conquered it, controlled it, dominated it for oh, goodness, almost 200 years, almost 2 centuries. They introduced a new language, a new monetary system. They introduced writing, coins. Lots of things was changed in northern India. First time it had ever been a coinage system in northern India. All right. 2 centuries later, he was conquered by Alexander. The Persians were conquered by Alexander the Great. This is a marble head of Alexander the Great. This is actually, good. Is this Darius in here, I think? I don't have notes on this imagery, but I think this is actually supposed to be Darius here with the Persian army. So the Persians come in the 500s and conquer northern India. 2 centuries later, the Greeks come in and conquer the Persians and also conquer northern India in the process. This region is also very famous for the place where Alexander's men mutinied. The Indus River Valley is where Alexander's men mutinied against him and forced him to turn back. He turned back, headed back towards Greece, never made it, died on the way back. But this is where Alexander the Great's conquest stopped, is India. We don't know what would have happened. Would he have conquered northern India? Maybe. Would it have made a difference? Probably not. Indian culture was so ingrained, it probably wouldn't have changed Indian culture. But who knows? Yeah, very interesting. And the one who's left in charge of India after Alexander's defeat is Seleucus, which eventually becomes known as the Seleucid Empire. So here we have a period of 500 years to where India is conquered multiple times. Persians, Greeks, the Seleucids, which means for this entire period, northern India is not really independent. It's almost always under the thumb of some outside authority, some sort of outside oppressive empire. Greece, Alexander the Great, 326. I don't know, I'm really waiting. You can always just pause it and write that down if you want. So, hell, I'll go on. So let's talk about the first real empire in India of Indians. Remember, everything the Persians did, the Seleucids did, everything the Greeks did, those weren't Indians. So we never actually had an Indian empire. Even if you want to go back to the Harappans was just a small civilization. There's no indication that the Harappans ever conquered others or ever really expanded outside of India. So they were never an empire. This is the actual first Indian empire. This is where a stronger power base conquers weaker neighbors and oppresses or subjugates weaker neighbors. This is the first one we'll talk about here. And Chandragupta, and the name Chandragupta is considered a heroic name in Indian culture. There are multiple Chandraguptas. This is actually common in most societies. If there's a really powerful king who's really revered by the society, whether India, Europe, or China, it doesn't matter, years later someone else will take the same exact name and say, and they want to sort of bring memories back of the great old days and the great leader and the great warrior and the great king and et cetera, and so there's actually been a couple of Chandraguptas that have had dominance and authority in Indian society. This is the first one we'll talk about anyway. He capitalized on this instability caused by Alexander, because Alexander came in, conquered, and then left almost immediately. The whole thing sort of came apart after Alexander's empire, we'll talk about, was huge and massive, the greatest empire the world ever known. It literally lasted, goodness, like 15 years, and then it just fell apart. Well, this is the farthest reach, the very edge of Alexander's empire. So it's not surprising that this is a part that falls apart one of the quickest, one of the soonest. It is on the very edge. So after he comes in and conquers around 326, BCE is when Alexander conquers India. He dies shortly after that, give or take. Within just 20 years, Chandragupta comes to power and takes over northern India. Pretty much the instability of when Alexander's empire collapsed, Chandragupta comes in and puts it back together, only this time under Indian authority, under Indian leadership. Ultimately, by 304, he's able to govern most of the Indian subcontinent. Well, let me say it differently. He's able to govern the upper half of the Indian subcontinent. We call India a subcontinent. Don't even ask me why. Ask a geography teacher. How big is India? Okay, Europe is called a continent. India, if you look on a map, it may not look like it. That's because Europeans designed all the maps. But India is actually bigger than all of Europe. India is one country, and Europe is, how many countries are in Europe today? 30 plus countries? Or more? India is bigger than all of Europe. Doesn't look like it on a map, but actual square miles, it is. And again, Europeans drew all the maps. You should look up what a real map looks like. You can actually look it up on the internet what the real world map looks like. Wait till you see how Africa is. Africa looks like half the entire world if you actually look at its real size. But of course, Europeans made it look much smaller. Reasons for that, obviously. So Chandragupta creates this real empire. He sets up a government. He divides his empire into different provinces. He sets up a tax system, creates a regular army, all elements of a modern empire. There's cities with universities, law courts, libraries, schools. It is a true civilization and empire greater than anything in this part of the world had ever existed. At this point in time, probably the most advanced modern cities in the world. Certainly more advanced than anything we see in Europe, or maybe China is close. So yeah, the most advanced cities in the world in this time period are probably Chinese and Indian. The most advanced technology and architecture and organization, bureaucracy, government. You want to know real government, look at the Chinese government, which we will talk about. Chandragupta was very suspicious, though, very duplicitous. He was paranoid. He saw assassins around every corner. His tactics to expand were very, don't get me wrong, appropriate to govern an empire. But basically, he used the enemy of my enemy as my friend tactic, sort of. He would make friends with an enemy, and then get that enemy to defeat another enemy. And of course, when they're fighting, even if they win, whoever wins is going to be weakened, right? Because they were at war with each other. So he makes friends with this person who battles this person. These two people fight. Whoever wins this one is probably weakened, and then he'll go in and conquer them. It's actually a no-brainer. It worked through his entire lifetime. And he conquered multiple enemies by getting them to fight against each other, weakening each other, and then he would march in with his armies and conquer them. A great conqueror, defeated many enemies, and he was brutal, violent. We often talk about, so-and-so conquered so-and-so, but we don't often talk about the real meaning of that. And I'll say this a few times in this class, and I want to make sure you really understand. When state A conquers state B, it's a lot more than just a few words. A conquered B. Conquering another power, conquering another nation, often results in massive bloodshed. Deaths in the tens, hundreds of thousands, even millions. Burning of cities. destruction of property, land, innocent people, women, children, burning of farms, killing of animals, destruction of the environment. Warfare is terrible. It's brutal. It's incredibly destructive. We gloss over it by talking about, oh, so-and-so beat so-and-so, and what do we say? Oh, there were 1,200 casualties, or there were 20,000 casualties, and then we move on. And we do, for sake of brevity, for sake of not trying to be depressing. But understand when we talk about that, those are real people that died, families that died, fathers, sons, brothers, kids, women that are raped, lives that are shattered every time. So every time there is this violence, and this happened everywhere. I mean, this is nothing special to India. Every society is like this, and it still is in modern times. Warfare is terrible, and it's incredibly destructive, and he was no different. He murdered and killed anyone who challenged him, burning cities, subjugating populations, and in a few years, he managed to conquer, between him and his son and grandson, forms this Mauryan dynasty, this Mauryan empire, which over time conquers, as you can see from the image here, most of India. So over the next 50 plus years between him and his immediate descendants, they're able to conquer most of what we think of as India. Probably what stopped him down here was the mountains and the deserts. There's some really large deserts down here and some mountain ranges. And of course, really in other places, it's really interesting how you could have mountains, deserts, and just not very far away, jungles. All of those things make it difficult to expand an empire for different reasons, but they're all prohibitive. Nonetheless, then we'll talk about what is often claimed to be the greatest conqueror in the history of Indian society, Ashoka. Hero or monster? If you really look at the things he did, it could be debated, because he also was probably the most destructive of all ancient Indian conquerors, and maybe one of the most murderous conquerors in world history, early world history. Ashoka. He reigned from 269 to 232, so some 37 years. Also one of the most important figures in Indian history for both what he did as a conqueror and what he did later in life when he converted to Buddhism. He really created a modern a contemporary, this time period, Indian empire, while simultaneously, after doing that, by befriending Buddhism, he really helped spread Buddhism across the old world. He was the grandson of Chandragupta, the one we were just talking about. And around 274, he rebelled against his older brother who claimed to be the king of the Mauryan dynasty. He rebels, he went to war with him, he kills him after 4 years of warfare, and in 269, he claims the throne of the Mauryan Empire. After brutal warfare and bloodshed, Indian killing Indian, who knows how many lives were lost, and of course, eventually getting his own brother killed. I don't know if he killed him personally or what, but his own brother eventually falls as well. He conquers the region of eastern India known as Kalinga. I'll go back. This is Kalinga, this eastern region over here of India. You can see the line here. I believe this is Ashoka. Yeah, he's got the purple line. This is Ashoka. Eventually conquers Kalinga, which no one else had been able to conquer. The violence involved of conquering Kalinga involved. What did Ashoka do? Ashoka would go in and burn entire cities down, killing the entire population to force other cities to surrender. He did murder and destruction on modern scale of violence, destruction, and bloodshed, only he did it back then with just swords and horses. The destruction of Ashoka, he does rank up in there as probably one of the most murderous conquerors in early world history, at least until we start talking about like the Huns and start talking about the Mongols and stuff like that, which of course is another almost 2,000 years after this, 1,500 years after this. Yeah. Why am I harping on this? Because it's important, because of what happens after the conquest. He creates massive violence, bloodshed, death, killing or enslaving hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 people. No one knows for sure. He even admitted this after his conversion to Buddhism. He admits that he was basically just a murderer, a mass murderer. All in the name of the empire, all in the name of conquering India and protecting India. He converts to Buddhism, and he then spends the rest of his life spreading the Buddhist message across India and actually into Asia, into East Asia. He undertakes pilgrimages to Buddhist holy sites. He is responsible for getting thousands of Buddhist temples and monasteries built. A lot of what are called stupas. I believe this is a stupa here, which is like a memorial shrine place for meditation, prayer, holy religious sites, many of which still exist today. These are sacred sites. He became a believer in nonviolence and compassion. He built large stone pillars. You see a picture on here. He built these large stone pillars all across Asia and the Middle East, similar to what Hammurabi did. Persians did this kind of stuff. May have learned the ideas from them. I mean, look how tall this pillar is. That's a horse right there. So what is this pillar, like 50 feet tall or something? And what did he have built on the pillars? Or he had inscribed on the pillars all the laws of Buddhism. All the different laws and codes of Buddhism, in addition to the laws of the Mauryan Empire. So you can find both inscribing of Buddhist scripture, if you will, Buddhist teachings, and then on the other side you can find lists of laws of the Mauryan Empire as well. It's a total 180-degree conversion. He goes from a brutal warlord to this Buddhist missionary, basically. Now, it isn't all sweet and roses and nice and, oh, he's wonderful, he's the greatest guy ever. Because he continues to be the king of the empire, or the emperor, whatever you want to call him. So through all the expansion of the Buddhist belief and all of the money he spent, by the way, where do you think all this money came from? Taxes. Massive taxes. So he was taxing and spending all the wealth of the empire instead of, it's like today when you see politicians talk about, supporting the military and stuff like that and supporting our national defense. Where do you think all the money is not being spent? When we spend half of our entire GDP on military defense and our military budget, where do you think the money's not being spent? It's not being spent on social services. It's not being spent to help the poor, the indigent. It's not being spent to rehabilitate criminals. It's not being spent on all that stuff. It's being spent on more tanks, planes, guns, and bombs. And no matter what your belief is on that, no matter which side you come down on that, it's simply a fact. If the money's being spent here, it's not being spent here. So he was doing the same thing. He was spending all this money on this. I mean, he built thousands of stupas and temples and holy sites and monasteries and pillars. Imagine how much wealth that had to involve. All the workers, all the time, the laborer. Sure, it gave some people jobs. That's good. Certainly, building infrastructure gives people work. But once the temple's built, what then? You can't eat it. You can't live there because it's a holy site. So it's not going to give you food. It's not going to give you shelter. It literally provides nothing for your family. It doesn't put food on the table. So again, it might give you a job while it's being built. But once it's built, and not to mention, Ashoka also had who knows how many slaves. We don't know what percentage of these structures were built by slaves, but we know some of them were built by slaves. So you got to understand, even when we say all these things that he did that promoted Buddhism, you got to see the underlying context of all this other stuff and all where the resources weren't being spent. Also, he didn't give up any of his land or territory. Even though he conquered, half of the entire empire was conquered by outright violence and subjugation and just mass killing, especially in the region of Kalinga. Did he give up the land? No. Did he back up and say, I apologize, I'm sorry, you can all have your freedom now? No, he didn't do any of that. So he used all this violence and aggression to build this massive empire. Then suddenly he decided, well, he's a really nice guy, but he doesn't actually give up any of it or really make amends. In his view, making amends was his dedication to Buddhism. Now, what does come out of this, which is really significant? He is maybe single-handedly responsible for keeping Buddhism alive. Buddhism actually, once Hinduism really starts to grow in dominance in India, Buddhism starts to shrink dramatically. And eventually Buddhism is entirely pushed out of India, pushed into East Asia. Today, where are most Buddhists in the world? East Asia, Southeast Asia. That's where most Buddhists are in the world today. So it gets entirely pushed out. He sort of keeps it alive for a while. And yeah, I mean, we don't know where Buddhism would be today if it hadn't been for Ashoka, but Ashoka is thought to probably be the greatest proponent of Buddhism until the last century, other than, Buddha himself. And Buddhism was never really great during Buddha's lifetime, as it never is. During the lifetime of Muhammad and Jesus and Buddha, the religion is actually really small and compact. In all these cases, the religion doesn't really explode until after the death of the prophets. So, it's interesting. Really is interesting. Eventually, the Mauryan dynasty declines. Only after a few decades, the Mauryan dynasty declines, and guess what? Once the Chandragupta family loses dominance, the India pretty much falls apart into a bunch of small kingdoms again. At least for several centuries. Here we have the North Gate of Sanchi. This is Ashoka built this. Ashoka was responsible for building this memorial shrine. That is another thing which should be noted. Today, why do people put their names on buildings? Why is there corporate names on buildings? Why is there names on libraries, like people's names? People do it for a legacy to be remembered forever. Same thing with Ashoka. Ashoka also knew that if he built all these monasteries, and by the way, his name is on all of them. Every single thing built by Ashoka, which still exists, and lots of things still exist, they all have somewhere a carving on them that, or an indication that says he built it. He was responsible for it being built. So, this is about his legacy. This is, even though Buddhism, of course, thrives for a time period under Ashoka, and as a result of what Ashoka does, it's also very indicative of how he wanted everyone to remember him. Because right alongside with that, there's indications, there's things that indicate that he did it. So he wanted everyone to remember him as well. Think about how Buddhism itself might have strengthened Ashoka's power. Elites in Indian society were mostly high caste Brahmins. Your elite people, again, it's the top of the caste system, right? The priests, they're at the top. So most of your elites in Indian culture were Brahmin. Another really important significance of him pushing Buddhism so hard and trying to actually get it made the official state religion, I don't think he does ever make it the state religion, but he effectively tries to. What effect would that have? If pretty much all of the other leaders in Indian culture are Hindu, and he wants to take power from them, what's one of the ways you would do it? Basically discount or delegitimize their religion. As in, my religion, Buddhism, is superior to your religion, Hindu. That would also be a way to take power from them, and take authority from them as well. Whose gods are you going to worship? Whose gods are you going to believe? Hindus' gods or Buddhist gods? Well, if I build all these things, literally thousands, maybe as many as 6,000 structures built during Ashoka's reign. How many still exist today? I don't know. But if he built all these things, he's basically putting his name on everything across the entire empire and saying Buddhism and Ashoka go hand in hand. Buddhism is great. Follow me. It's a power grab. Yeah. So no matter whatever happens, no matter what things people do, there's just always an ulterior motive. Call me cynical, whatever. I dare you. I mean, it's just find something where someone does something without no real ulterior motive. At least we're talking about world history here. No. If you're a politician and you're doing something, there's always an underlying reason. Beyond the obvious. Always is. At least I think so. And certainly Ashoka was using this as a power grab as well, as a way to legitimize his authority and delegitimize authority of others. But it does, perhaps, and we aren't sure, but perhaps it saves Buddhism, which was actually a very minor belief by the 2nd and 1st century. We see Buddhism, by the 3rd century, really see Buddhism not very commonly held. And he pretty much revives the religion, and it significantly survives afterwards. So, small states and trade networks, this is where we're going to end. So, following the collapse of the Mauryan dynasty, around 185 BCE, numerous foreign powers moved in to control the Indus River Valley, northern India. There were Indo-Greeks, many of these who ruled in place of sort of the inheritors of Alexander's old empire, sort of the Seleucids, the descendant of the Seleucids, which are the ones that took over after Alexander's empire collapsed. You have the Scythians that came from East Asia, who also challenged Chinese civilization. They sort of looked for to challenge what was left of the Mauryan Empire, the Mauryan dynasty. It's centuries. According to this, yeah, this is about right. About 500, this is BCE to CE, 500 years. So for pretty much 500 years, India is a collection of kingdoms and small states and small independent authorities. No real unified empire or national authority for centuries in India. So there was this one short-lived empire which lasted, 100 years, give or take? 100, 120 years. And then we have almost 500 years of small independent kingdoms. However, it's really significant in the fact that because we had such open exchange of people's ideas, and don't get me wrong, it was by force, a lot of times by force, military occupation. But we had this constant exchange of ideas, people, culture, language, science, technology, and disease. Bear in mind, anytime we talk about the good stuff, exchange of ideas and knowledge, we also got to talk about the bad stuff. The trade routes often carry disease, infection, plague, stuff like this. And of course, new technology is not as good either, because new technology, what is inherent in that? What kind of new technologies do also move along trade routes? War technologies, of course, military technologies, new and better ways to kill people. But due to the fact that we did have all this exchange across northern India, which was right on the trade routes, right on the ancient Silk Road, which connected China with the Mediterranean, India's right there at the edge of it. So lots of this information disseminated and filtered down into India. And you add in addition that there's no real unified country, which means there's this constant turmoil and upheaval and overturn, so there's always something new coming in. There's always a new people coming in, a new language coming in, new culture, new ideas, always coming in. You combine with this that we have multiple competing religions. We have Hinduism, we have Buddhism, you have all the epic history of India, its culture, its religion, its epic writings. Surprisingly enough, and it really is sort of surprising, the actual Indian culture actually becomes more cemented. It actually becomes more resilient and defensive, to where Indian culture, by the turn of the millennia, 2,000 years ago, culturally, socioculturally, doesn't really change. What it means to be an Indian person religiously, socioculturally, doesn't really change for centuries. It isn't a lot different. I mean, today's the modern world, but socioculturally, Indian sociocultural beliefs and way of life and hasn't really changed much in the last couple thousand years. It's been surprisingly resilient and consistent, especially considering that there were so many invaders and so much overturning in northern India that it's almost surprising that Indian peoples managed to hold on to the cohesiveness of their culture. Yet they do. The only really significant change, truthfully, is that they push out Buddhism, which we'll talk about in another chapter. Eventually, Buddhism is almost entirely extricated, eradicated in India. And, of course, the introduction of Islam, which does shake some things up here in, several more, 600-700s CE. We see the introduction of Islam into India, which shakes some things up. But ultimately, that ends up getting extricated out of India, too. Eventually, most Islamic people in India end up forming their own country, Pakistan. So even today, India is socioculturally Hindu and has managed surprisingly to hold on to that in a variety of ways for well over 2 millennia now. It's really interesting how it's managed to happen. So with all of this change, we actually find an interesting permanence in India. That may be the very reason it became that way, though, too. Simply as a way of trying to maintain their culture, it became hardwired. Because there were so many competing influences, always different peoples and cultures and religions and beliefs coming in, constantly bombarding the Indian population, they put up these walls and said, no, we are not, no matter what happens, going to allow our culture to be really significantly altered. And that's pretty much what happens. So some cultures, when they constantly mix with others, they simply assimilate and they morph into a new evolved culture. And evolved here, don't take it as good or bad, simply something changing. They evolve into a different culture. India went the other direction, basically put up barriers and said, no, we're not going to change our culture, and we're going to try to remain basically static socioculturally. So it's interesting how different societies react to things differently. And also, this isn't like it was a concerted effort of the people. This isn't like all Indian people got together and made this decision. It's just what happened. It's the way things actually worked out. China is actually surprisingly like this too, when we talk about China. We see a lot of sociocultural permanence in China. Once it's established, the sociocultural society in China doesn't really change much until modern times. It's interesting. Anyway, so that's going to be where the chapter ends, and we will come back to India again one more time later. That's it for this chapter now, and thanks for going through it with me. Peace.